Cars was regarded as the ultimate thing in his series. Would that remain true if we put him in Dragon Ball though? Let's place him up against a Dragon Ball gauntlet of sorts. A little bit different from the ones we normally do. Dragon Ball already had its own perfect life form, but let's see how they handle the ultimate life form. Like my other gauntlets, this one will have 2 phases, with the first one covering how far he goes with his standard power based on what we've actually seen. The second phase will be more hypothetical, covering his specific abilities and how far they could potentially take him, although it's a bit more based on assumptions. First, we have a quick rundown of Cars' abilities, as well as the power that he's starting out with. I'll keep the scaling brief because Dragon Ball has such a huge jump in power early on, and no matter where you place certain characters, they get outdone pretty much immediately. Let's begin with his stats. Cars is physically one of the strongest JoJo characters in his original verse. Of course, other characters do have powerful hacks from their stands, but in terms of actual raw power, just physical strength alone, Cars is at the top of that. In my videos, I tend to scale him between city level and mountain level, and because he physically scales above so many other JoJo characters, he's also massively faster than Light, somewhere in the hundreds of times faster than Light range. And even without scaling him to other characters in later parts, he has his own faster than Light feats. So, even though he's not really strong in comparison to a lot of Dragon Ball characters, he is pretty fast. Again, physical power doesn't really matter much here, but speed kind of does, because Dragon Ball gets really strong really quick, but in terms of speed, a lot of these crazy faster than light, massively faster than light things, that's later on in the Z portion of the series. But we're not too focused on stats here. More so, we're concerned about what Cars is capable of, his abilities. So let's go through them real quick. Cars is immortal. You can defeat him by sending him into space, which causes him to get frozen up and just not be able to move, but you're gonna have a really hard time killing him. It's not impossible, but his regeneration makes it really tough. It's not as crazy as someone like Cell, for example, who could regenerate from a single cell, but still, it's really good because at worst, it's stated that he can still be alive as dust. Cars can also kind of possess people by going into their body and then controlling them that way. His body is capable of a lot of weird things like digesting other people through acid, and absorbing them that way too. And in case it wasn't clear, in this video we're using Ultimate Cars, so this is him at the end of part 2, at his strongest. He already did have body manipulation before, like he can contort it in all weird ways, but at this point he could do even more things with it, like biological manipulation. He could use the abilities of any organism on Earth, and we'll get more into that later on. But it's so potent that he can manipulate himself on a cellular level, allowing him to manipulate his cells to be that of any organism, which means he could shapeshift as well. Cars is also insanely intelligent. His IQ is 400. And beyond having a great IQ, he has great senses too. Besides being able to do everything that any animal on Earth is capable of, his senses are just crazy to begin with. Like, for reference, his eyes are compared to a space telescope. He also has access to Hamon, and he's the strongest user of it in the series. And most importantly, Cars is really adaptable. Given his great intelligence and all his crazy abilities, that's a deadly combination because he could adapt to pretty much any sort of situation that he needs to adapt to, growing and evolving within the moment, and easily strategizing. So, now that we got a baseline of what he's capable of and how strong he is, let's start the gauntlet himself. First phase, just looking at his standard powers, seeing physically what he can contend with. So in this phase, we're assuming Cars isn't going to pull any crazy stunt like learning Ki on a whim or turning himself into a Saiyan or whatever. Just based on raw power alone, let's see how far he goes based on that. This part will be more objective because it's based on actual strength and not hypotheticals. The first few arcs aren't really an issue for him. Roshi poses the biggest threat at max power, but he's way too slow for Cars. Cars outspeeds pretty much everyone until we get to the end of Namek, so in terms of speed, he's fine here. His combat and reactions are hundreds of times the speed of light, and because of that, he won't get matched until that point. But in terms of power, well, he starts facing issues around the 22nd World Tournament because pretty much every top tier character there is a Moonbuster. But his speed will definitely be helpful, and if he's not completely destroyed in one shot, he can regenerate. Of course, any of these Moonbusting characters have the potential to destroy him in one shot, but if they leave some dust from him behind, he can come back from that. Moonbusting is definitely way too much for him to handle, but what's the point if he could just dodge everything really easily? It's like putting a squirrel against a car. Yeah, the car's just gonna eviscerate the squirrel. But what if that car is only going 20 miles an hour and that squirrel is going like 5,000 miles per hour or something? Ridiculous analogy, I know, but it's kind of what will happen. That car is just not gonna hit the squirrel. If it does, the squirrel is screwed, but it won't get hit. Anyways, by this point in the story, raw power won't be enough, so Cars can survive, but he cannot fight. At least not in traditional terms. He probably does have some ways to combat others, but for that we would have to delve into his abilities. So, I guess now's the point where Phase 2 starts. I know what you're all here for. With his abilities and adaptation, where could he get to? Before we delve into the hypotheticals of what he can accomplish, there's a brief detour we need to make in regards to what he could transform into. Cars can mimic everything that lives on Earth. I know all of you are thinking right now, if we're throwing him into Dragon Ball, could he adapt his DNA to other life forms in it? Well, it depends. Assuming we just throw him into Dragon Ball and he has no prior knowledge of any of the species here, I think he could at least adapt his Saiyan DNA. If he was from the verse, then he would definitely have Saiyan DNA and Namekian DNA, because Goku, Kami, Piccolo, everyone that was previously on Earth. But let's go with the former because that's more conservative. We're just throwing him in here and he has no knowledge of anything. As for Saiyan DNA, there is one big thing to consider. Saiyans and humans can have kids together. I swear this is going somewhere. We're going to be applying real-world science here, which may not fit Dragon Ball, but we often do that for power scaling anyways, so it's kind of fair to do the same here. This isn't a one-off case either. In canon, we've seen Goku and Vegeta obviously have kids with humans, and even down the line, Gohan had his own kid. Plus, while it's not part of the same continuity, we've seen the lineage of hybrid Saiyans extend very far to Goku Jr. and Vegeta Jr., which I know you're probably going to say not canon, but still worth mentioning because every part of the series, no matter what continuity it's from, it considers Saiyans and humans to be fully compatible in terms of mating. This means Saiyans are biologically really similar to humans. They can have multiple healthy generations of kids together with no problems, which requires very little variance in DNA. Sure, maybe Saiyans are like Filtramites and they could just reproduce with anything, but funny enough, Toriyama had said before that Kais may frequently split up species and transport them around planets. So not only are Saiyans and humans genetically really close, but there is a very real chance that they might have a common ancestor. In short, this means Cars should be able to adapt his Saiyan DNA very easily, even if we don't give him that right off the bat. That Saiyan sex ed lesson had a purpose. This has insane implications because Saiyans of course are pretty powerful by default, but more importantly, this gives him access to Zenkai boost and even transformations. Combine that with regen and, well, we saw what happened with Cell. On top of that, Cars might actually be able to use alien DNA. This is more contentious but worth mentioning. In the manga and the anime's diagram of Cars, as well as Araki's input from JoJo 6251, it's stated that Cars can use abilities from all living things. It's a vague statement, but aliens do exist in JoJo, and if you interpret this very literally, Cars shouldn't just be limited to Earth. It's every living thing. Contextually, it seems to apply to Earth though, and of course, by this point in the story, aliens weren't shown in JoJo, and we don't know if Cars has prior knowledge of them or not. It's not like he could just automatically become something he's never seen before. So because of how vague and arguable this is, and the fact that this won't matter too much anyways, we'll just go with it being Earth life forms and Saiyans, considering how close they are to humans. But just having Saiyan DNA won't make him strong by default. He would also need to learn about Ki first. The good thing is though, he should be able to adapt to and learn Ki. Pretty easily in fact. Normal humans in Dragon Ball can learn about Ki, and Cars is far beyond a normal human's capabilities and knowledge. When thrown into this verse, even if he's just starting at 0 with Ki, right away his senses are far better than any other human, and he could detect things normal people can't. This could easily lead him down the path to sensing Ki, then learning it for himself. It shouldn't be hard for a 400 IQ vampire that could duplicate anything humans can do, and someone who did the same with Hamon already. I don't think either of those things are crazy to say because with Ki, that is basically a given considering Cars could do anything a human could do but better. As for the Saiyan DNA, it's not a crazy stretch. Cars also can't evolve from battles regardless, so even if adapting to alien DNA might be a bit of a stretch, and the fact that we don't want to pull a no limits fallacy and say he can copy everyone's DNA, we'll just stop it at Saiyan DNA, which is pretty reasonable in my eyes. By the way, if you're enjoying this video so far, hit a Hamon overdrive on that like button. It really does help out the channel and gives me good feedback. So with that detour out of the way, where could he go from here? Using Saiyan DNA and Ki for himself, alongside all his other adaptations and strategies, Cars could probably carry himself all the way through Namek with no problems, since he already is faster and now will also have the same strength as everyone else. And when his strength grows, his speed would too. But that's all assuming he actually has the time to train and prepare. Now the question is completely different. How long could he keep up with everyone for? This part is a lot less objective and more subjective, but we do have some things to work off of. Knowing his adaptation, intelligence, and access to Saiyan abilities like Zenkai's, he will be really hard to kill at first. Again, assuming he has time to train and prepare. Like, if we just gave Cars some Ki and Saiyan DNA and throw him against full power Frieza on Namek, he's cooked immediately. He doesn't instantly just grow strong by being a Saiyan. None of that matters if he doesn't have time to grow. So let's do it a bit different in this video. This section of the video is more like, what if Cars was part of the Dragon Ball verse? Would he be able to make it through everything if he took Goku's place and had the same amount of training? Like I said, nothing up to Namek would be a struggle because with that same amount of training, Cars would definitely grow beyond all the other villains around him. And pretty much by default, he outspeeds a lot of them. Once we get to Namek, that's where things get a little bit more convoluted. Ginyu does pose a threat, but with Cars' intelligence, he could find a way. Ginyu would probably try to take Cars' body, but Cars won't even let that happen in the first place given his smarts and speed. Or maybe he would, just to learn how Ginyu did it, and then replicate himself. Very much a hypothetical, but funny thing to note. It's definitely better than his own possession too. But anyways, once Cars gets past this, what's next? Well, of course he could regenerate, so if he does take any damage, he's just gonna grow from it, and he'll heal himself. Exploiting Zenkais would be really hard because he can't just injure himself and then grow back from that. Like Vegeta showed on Namek, you have to have someone else injure you. So maybe he could utilize that during these fights. Once he gets to Frieza, he wouldn't counter an issue. Goku was weaker than Frieza and had to utilize the Kaioken and Spirit Bomb, the latter of which Cars wouldn't even be capable of, and the former Cars could do, but only if he actually knew about it. He has Saiyan DNA, but he doesn't just have every Goku ability right off the bat. So assuming he got to Goku's level of power here, how is he going to fight Frieza, because Frieza's stronger now? There is a way. Given Cars' grasp on his own biology, there's a chance he could just figure out how to transform on his own. Yes, I mean, he could just transform into Super Saiyan. As much as people might not like the whole S-cells thing, it's important here because Cars wouldn't have a lot of them right off the bat. But what stops him from just creating more? As we've discussed, Cars can manipulate anything with his cells. And at least part of Super Saiyan is based on genetics. So, Cars gives himself Saiyan DNA, figures out how to push himself farther, discovers his own S-cells, and then replicates them. Then, Cars figures out how to go Super Saiyan, realizing that if he excites these cells, he's able to transform. Then we have Super Saiyan Cars versus Frieza. He wins. Even when we just limit his DNA to Saiyans, he's still really cracked. Now, Frieza could probably just stop him by destroying Namek. I mean, Cars won't die in space like Goku, for example, but we've seen what happens when he gets sent into space. He just freezes up, and that essentially does defeat him. Unless he's somehow able to copy Frieza, space is a pretty surefire defeat for him. So, Cars has a way to make it past this, but it's not a guarantee. It's not like it's going to be an easy fight. Let's move on to the Android saga and assume he's also grown strong enough here to actually fight the androids given the same amount of training. The androids aren't really going to do anything to him. Their infinite energy engines will give some help, but they're not going to be smart enough to outplay him. But now things get weird because what's he going to do with Super Saiyan by this point? If he has had more training, would he be smart enough to figure out how to master Super Saiyan faster than anybody else did in the story? Better yet, go beyond it? Considering Cars' IQ and how intricately he can manipulate his cells, there is a very real chance that he's able to do this, accessing the different grades of Super Saiyan and maybe even Super Saiyan 2, or 3 even. But let's keep it simple for now and say he's just moving along and he's able to keep up in terms of power, and we'll just place him wherever Goku is. I mean, that's pretty reasonable. Both are geniuses, at least when it comes to combat for Goku. Cars versus Cell would be kind of funny because, you know, ultimate life form versus perfect life form, both genetic masterpieces with regeneration. Cell's regeneration is much better than Cars since he can come back from a single cell. For Cars, he requires at least dust to come back from, if not more. Cell could also do the whole blow up Earth thing too, and this would be a lot easier for him. Like, if Cell self-destructs, which is pretty likely, we've already seen him do this before, then he wins. He might get desperate in the fight and then blow himself up. Cars wouldn't be able to do anything about it because he can't teleport away. He's stuck on Earth, and when it's gone, he's frozen in space. Or maybe he gets caught up in the explosion and that just kills him, completely eviscerating him. That is a really easy win condition for Cell right there, and a very likely one too, because that's exactly what happened in the main story. If he's just fighting Cell one-on-one and Cell gets really desperate, Cars is going to lose here. But it's not a surefire loss for him because, again, knowing Cars' adaptability and knowledge, as well as his great senses, after fighting Cell for a bit, he'd probably figure out how his regeneration works. And while Cell can survive as just a single cell, if that core is destroyed, then that kills Cell. So Cars could easily just figure out how to do that, locating the source of his regeneration and just stopping it for good. Well, what about the Buu Saga? First off, against Babidi, he wouldn't really have a counter for magic because that's not something he could just adapt to right away. There is some magic on Earth, but Cars hasn't encountered that yet. And if he has, it's definitely not to the level of Babidi's. More important is the fact that Babidi could try and take over his mind, and I wonder how susceptible Cars would be. He's definitely evil enough for this to work on him, but we don't know how Babidi's mind control will interact with a smart mind like his, or if Cars would find some way around that. Also, against Buu, that would be a really tough fight because Buu has even greater regen than Cell and access to magic too. Granted, it's not as crazy as Babidi, but it makes me wonder how he would react to this. And could he replicate magic? Maybe, but again, he's never seen it before. One good thing is if Cars is hit by a candy beam, he could at least turn himself back to normal with his own body manipulation, so he can counter that. Although if he's turned to stone by Dabura, he could probably quickly counter that by cutting one of his body parts off. But as we saw in part 2, petrification kinda does work on him in the first place. I feel like Cars would be smart enough and fast enough to work around that, realizing what's happening before it's too late and having a way to counter it. But if Dabura just spits a bunch on him and gets a lucky shot in his head, maybe that could win. So by this point in the story, the fights are really up in the air because it depends on what Cars can do, and I don't want to get too much into the hypothetical because we're already kind of far in there, and any further I'd just be saying, oh yeah, Cars wins because probably he could. No, I don't want to do that. And once again, space is an option. If he ends up fighting Kid Buu, it's an instant loss. Kid Buu is single-minded and will probably just go to destroy the planet right away. When he first appeared, that is exactly what he did. His first move might just be to blow up everything, and then Cars is screwed. And unlike Cell, stopping his regeneration is really hard because Cell at least has the core that he could destroy. Buu can come back from pretty much nothing, and he doesn't have a defined core that he regenerates from. It's like if any little single piece of him is left, Even if he has like a small cell of him somewhere else on the battlefield, that's going to be enough. And by Battle of Gods, I think it's safe to say Kars has stopped hard here. So first off, it's not like he could just get Godly Ki. It's a new thing to him, awakened by training or ritual, and something that they didn't have prior knowledge of. So it's not something that Kars could just mutate, especially when he can't even sense it in the first place. Kars does have a great mind and great senses, but the Masters of Ki on Earth by this point were physically incapable of sensing it and manipulating it as well, at least until they obtained it themselves. Kars wouldn't have a way to get it for himself unless he does do the ritual, and he wouldn't fit that without the right kind of heart. And he would need other people in the first place to do so. He's in Goku's place here, so we'll put him up against Beerus, and he's not doing anything. He won't be able to become a god, and he'd likely just piss Beerus off if anything. Then he gets Hakkai'd, and he's done. Also, if we threw him up against Goku by this point, for example, he's not doing anything with the lack of Godly Ki. And if you want to say he finds a way to impress Beerus and somehow makes it to Resurrection F, by that point he's going to be power gapped so hard that it wouldn't even make a difference. So I think we could pretty safely say, with raw power alone, Kars makes it to the 22nd World Tournament. Most likely, relying a lot on his abilities, he can make it to Namek, but he's not really going to be doing much there unless he could actually adapt his Saiyans and basically become one and do everything that Goku does. And if he is able to do that, then he could probably make it up to the Buu Saga, and at best Battle of Gods, but he's not going further than that. It's a pretty fitting end. Kars is the ultimate life form in his world, but once we start seeing all the otherworldly and godly stuff in Dragon Ball Super, he's gonna have issues. We could just go the cheap route and interpret the statement about him being able to replicate anything in the world as the universe as a whole, but I think that at least gives a somewhat grounded answer as to how far he could go in this verse. Keyword, somewhat, not fully grounded. Anyways, let me know what you think below. And as usual, be sure to be civil in the comments. We're just having a fun discussion here. Anyways, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you on my next video.